Order, order. Can I call Mr. Tanmanjit Singh Desai to move the motion?
Thank you, Sir George. It is a pleasure to serve once again under your chairmanship, and I am very grateful to have secured and to be able to bring forward this important debate on the scandal that is in work poverty. It is a debate that shouldn't be needed in the 21st century in one of the wealthiest nations in the world, and yet here we are. What I hope this debate will explore is why so many people are facing unacceptable levels of poverty, not when out of work, but while working and earning a living. If you work hard, you can earn a decent wage, you can buy a house, you can raise a family. It's the promise the government made to the country in their last election manifesto when they stated, and I quote, "We will help people and families throughout their lives by bringing down the cost of living and making sure that work always pays." And Sir George, I don't think it's controversial to say that I agree. People who work hard should be able to earn a decent wage. People who work hard should be able to afford a home and raise a family. A job that pays, a home that's your own, and a family you can support. There are some great gifts being bestowed by a generous government. These are the key indicators of a healthy and functioning society. They are our modest expectations and reasonable aspirations, and any half-competent government should be expected to deliver them. But cruelly, over the last 13 years, this Conservative government has not only failed to do their job and deliver for the British people, but they have systematically, either by incompetence or intention, or probably both, prevented millions across the UK from getting on in life, trapping them in an inescapable cycle of poverty and hardship. The Department for Work and Pensions data shows that 1 in 5 people in the UK were in relative poverty in 2021-22. It's clear that working does not preclude a family or an individual from poverty. 71% of children in poverty after housing costs are in working families, and 57% of working age adults in work poverty has increased by a shocking 1.5 million compared with when the Conservatives took office in 2010. And there are 3 overarching reasons, Sir George, for why things have become so bad: earnings, housing, and the cost of living. And on each, the government have taken a bad situation and made it much, much worse. Wages today are at the same levels as they were in 2005. That's the longest period of stagnation in terms of earnings in nearly 200 years. Public services have been cut to the bone, and many public sector workers have seen their pay significantly eroded by years of below-inflation rises. At the same time, there's been an explosion in the gig economy and other insecure work, a damning indictment of the Tories' economic and political choices, and which have forced ever more people to rely on the benefit system. Yes, I will give way.
Giving way, congratulating on securing this debate. He mentions the gig economy. One of the reasons, or 3 of the reasons for in-work poverty are insecure work and zero-hour contracts, bogus self-employment and low wages. These were promises made by the government on a Taylor report made 8 years ago, and we're still waiting for that employment bill. We need that employment bill now, don't we?
I thank my honourable friend, and I couldn't agree with him more. We've actually had debates. In fact, I remember standing in this very place, Sir George, when I managed to secure a debate on the Taylor Review and on working practices. In fact, some of the very same members who are sitting here in this debate were in that debate when we were asking for the employment bill to be brought into practice. And it was shocking then that of the 53 agreed areas of legislation, only 7 were actually enacted, and that intransigence is what is leading to more in-work poverty. But 13 years of successive Conservative governments have sought to undermine social security in our country. Universal credit is not protecting working families from poverty. More than a third of children and working age adults in working families in receipt of universal credit are still in poverty after housing costs. Ms Clark, one of my constituents in Slough, is a nurse who supported the most vulnerable during the COVID-19 pandemic. She is struggling, Sir George, to pay for the loans she took out for her training and having to claim universal credit. For this, she must take annual leave to attend her appointments at the job centre. How is any of this fair or right? A nurse and a single mother without the support she clearly requires. I will give way to my honourable friend from Washington and Sunderland.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way, and he's making an excellent speech about in-work poverty. Would he agree with me that one of the ways that we could alleviate in-work poverty for those, definitely at the lower end of the wage spectrum is through a measure such as universal free school meals, which we see extended in Scotland already to primary schools, in Wales to primary schools, and the London Mayor has announced it's going to be extended across London to primary schools. Northern Ireland has a higher earnings threshold at 14,000, which is double the England threshold of 7,400. Does he agree that for those people in work but still in poverty, that would be a massive boost that would really help them, especially the ladies just spoken about?
I thank my honourable friend, and she has indeed been a doughty champion of free school meals. I know she has, being known as the APPG Queen, has organised various events, including on free school meals. And I remember actually going with the dinner ladies, with the gents, as we served free school meals, just to highlight the importance of them. And in fact, I thank my honourable friend, because I will be touching upon this later on in my speech to bring home that point of view. And Sir George, this punitive benefit system is driving more people to use food banks. At Slough Food Bank in my constituency, kind, amazing people who undertake much needed selfless service, they report that 6 in 10 people they support are on universal credit, and many of them are employed. Charities like this openly acknowledge that they'd rather not be in existence because they don't want a society where working people are forced to rely on food parcels to survive. It's worth noting that in 2010, the Trussell Trust only operated 35 food banks. Staggeringly, Sir George, today that number is closer to 1,300 across the UK, which between April 2022 to March 2023 gave out 3 million emergency food parcels. That's a third more than during the pandemic and double that of pre-pandemic levels. What a shocking legacy this government is leaving behind. And I will give way to my honourable friend from Barnsley.
Debate. In Barnsley, we have seen a tripling of demand for food banks, and as he rightly points out, we didn't have any 10, 15 years ago, and it is because of this government that, sadly, 35% of kids in Barnsley are growing up in poverty, and families are relying on food banks, and they're in work, and they can't afford to pay their bills.
My honourable friend from Barnsley has eloquently explained what the experts themselves across our country are explaining, that we are seeing this happening before our very eyes, and we should not be allowing this situation to deteriorate any further. And Sir George, as many will know and experience, housing is a huge and growing driver of in-work poverty. Thanks to this government's failure to build enough new and affordable homes, new social housing, the gulf between the prices of houses compared with earnings in the UK last year was the worst since 1876. Yes, I did say 1876. We really are back in Victorian times under this government. One of my Slough constituents privately rents and wrote to me for help. Sir George, like many other private renters experience, they have been served with a Section 21 no-fault eviction notice. Their partner works full-time, but they can't work full-time hours because of their cancer. High rent costs mean they cannot find anywhere that is now affordable, and although the family are on universal credit, it doesn't cover the basic cost of living. And even if they did find somewhere where the rent was affordable, the need for a large deposit and a guarantor have erected huge barriers to finding new long-term accommodation. The supply of social housing has continued to plummet, and the government's promised, then cancelled promise, then reinstated promise of building 300,000 new homes each year hasn't materialised. And as my right honourable friend, the Leader of the Opposition, said in Prime Minister's questions today, house building has collapsed and the government isn't anywhere near its target. That means more people are trapped in private rental accommodation as rents go through the roof, meaning people are taking longer to save for their first house. That's why levels of home ownership are down and private renting is up. Those that have been fortunate enough to finally buy a home after years and years of saving are now facing mortgage misery, the likes of which we haven't seen in generations, perhaps longer, thanks to this government's inability to get to grips with inflation. Perhaps if ministers were more focused on supporting those impacted by their child benefit cap, rather than removing the cap on bankers' bonuses and spending public money to invest in our public services, rather than giving away billions in failed PPE contracts to their mates, to their cronies, then our economy would be in a much better place. Sadly, so many are in dire straits, and on top of stagnant earnings and unaffordable housing, we have a cost of living crisis driving ever more people into in-work poverty. With food prices soaring, energy and utility bills going through the roof, many working people are finding themselves unable to put meals on their tables, heat their homes, pay their bills, or provide for their families. And yes, I will give way.
Member for giving way. He won't be surprised to say I take a slightly different interpretation of some of the issues that he's presented today. But on one thing, I think we will certainly agree, which is that there are a lot of public sector workers who have seen real terms reductions in their pay, and I draw the House's attention to my declaration of members' interest as a practising NHS doctor. Would he agree with me that it's particularly important that the government does implement the recommendations of the national pay review bodies in terms of public sector pay?
I thank the honourable member, and while we may disagree on certain things, I think facts, hard-hitting facts, especially when the truth hits us, is hard to ignore. And in terms of the independent review bodies and their recommendations, while I would agree that their work is very important, we have seen that the government, even this week, including the Prime Minister, have not actually accepted that. They are very selective in when they actually agree to those independent review bodies. And that's something that must change. Either they comply with them or they completely disregard them. It can't be both to suit their needs as and when required. And yes, I will give way to my honourable friend.
Confirm then that it is the front bench Labour position that it would implement the public sector pay review?
I thank my honourable friend. Today I'm not in the front bench, and I'm sure that the Shadow Minister will be highlighting exactly what the Labour Party front bench policy is on that. But as far as I'm concerned, I think it's very important that if we have independent review bodies, then either they are respected and that their work is respected, or we don't have those independent review bodies. So I'm sure that will be teased out in due course. The Office for Budget Responsibility, Sir George, forecasted in March 2023 that real household disposable income per person, a measure of living standards, will fall by a cumulative 5.7% between 2022 and 2024. This would be the largest two-year fall since records began back in the 50s. One of my Slough constituents, Sir George, wrote to tell me that they, as a family of 5, despite having a full-time worker and the support of Universal Credit, they still could not afford their children's school lunches, which my honourable friend from Washington and Sunderland alluded to earlier. Imagine having to send your children off to school knowing that they're hungry. Imagine knowing that you've done everything you can to provide for them. You've worked hard, you've sought support, you've tried your hardest. Imagine still knowing that there is nothing more that you can do and that your children will be going hungry. It's a desperate situation for so many, and one we should not be seeing in the world's 6th largest economy. But Sir George, child poverty in the UK is overwhelmingly an issue of in-work poverty. 67% of children living in relative poverty in our country come from working households. Children living in a household where at least one adult is in work have seen a steep rise in poverty under the Tories, and absolute poverty has not fallen since Labour was in power. While the Conservatives have been in power, it has stagnated and most concerningly started to rise. Absolute child poverty, though, is set to increase even more by the end of this year, meaning another 400,000 children could, day to day, be going hungry, cold, and or even homeless. Is this government not ashamed? Yes, I will give way to my honourable friend.
I'm grateful again to my honourable friend for giving way, and I just want to add some further statistics to the ones he's very helpfully providing us with around hungry children. And that is the economics of universal free school meal. PricewaterhouseCoopers have done some work looking at the numbers, and for every £1 invested in universal free school meals, the return on investment to the economy in savings on health, child poverty, malnutrition, all of the rest is £1.71. So for every £1, the return's £1.71. Does he not think that that proves that this policy would pay for itself?
I thank my honourable friend, and indeed I defer to her expertise, and I'm sure that the Minister is listening and will be looking at why this is so important. But, Sir George, we need a government who will focus on breaking the cycle of poverty, who will ensure that respect and dignity are once more at the heart of our social security system, who make it easier to own a home, to raise a family, and can put an end to the soaring use of food banks. In conclusion, Sir George, we need an economy and a system that works for everyone, not just a select few, one that doesn't embed poverty through low-paid, insecure work, one that doesn't leave children without meals or homes, one that doesn't see the hard-working go hungry. Thank you very much.
The question is that the the question is that the where are we? I've got on the wrong page here. Sorry. Yeah. The question is that the House has considered in-work poverty. I do apologise for that. I'm going to impose a 4-minute limit on backbench speeches, and I may have to, in view of the number of people who are standing, I may have to lower it again. Ian Lavery.
Thank you, Sir George. And as ever, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship. And I want to place on record my thanks to my honourable friend, the member for Slough, for bringing this very important debate to the chamber. I think I want to start, Sir George, by a couple of statements that have been made in the past week or so, which I think are absolutely outrageous. The first one being, and I quote, "I want people to be reassured that we've got to hold our nerve, stick to the plan, and we will get through this." That's the Prime Minister. And I think people who are in work, in poverty, will be wondering what on earth the Prime Minister of this country, one of the richest people in the country, knows about in-work poverty. I have no doubt that the Prime Minister works very, very hard indeed, but he gets the rewards. As the honourable member, my friend from Slough, said earlier in his fantastic contribution, the likes of the Prime Minister will not have seen his kids go to school with an empty belly, not have seen them go to school with holes in their shoes or clothes that's been passed down from the older siblings or perhaps get from somewhere else? Or indeed, will he have used the food bank? For heaven's sake, I've got to ask that question. The second statement I want to raise is a statement from the Governor of the Bank of England. We cannot continue to have the current level of wage increases. The current levels, I'll be absolutely honest to say, are unsustainable. This is a man who's on in excess of £500,000. Then the same applies to him. He'll not have had any difficulties when indeed he's been making these decisions in telling people who are in poverty, who cannot feed their own kids, telling them that they've got to accept that they cannot have decent pay increases. The fact that inflation is as high as it is isn't to do with wages for ordinary people. Ordinary people haven't had wage increases, or I should say wage stagnation, shows quite clearly that there hasn't been much of an increase since 2005. And look at the situation in the country. Sir George, I've been on the picket lines with many people over the past few years, most of them fighting for decent wages, terms and conditions. Most of them now having to use food banks. I'll ask a question. Why? And I'll ask the Minister, why on earth in this day and age, the sixth richest economy in the world, should teachers, should nurses, should doctors, should ancillary workers, should teachers, should the public sector workers, why should they have to rely on food banks? This is the UK. We're not a third world country. And I ask the Minister, please, to tell us why it's right, why it's acceptable that people in the health service could do a hard day's graft and have to visit the food bank to feed their kids, why the teachers are having to do the same, and why public sector workers, particularly those who are dealing with the likes of the DWP benefits, why 1 in 5 of people in the public sector working in the DWP and HMRC are actually claiming universal credit. It's an absolute outrage. The fact that people are saying that the route out of poverty is work is an absolute nonsense.
Thank you, Sir George. Can I first of all thank the Honourable Member for Slough for raising this important issue, which indeed affects all of our constituencies. In the short time, I want to give an Northern Ireland perspective to it, and I also want to give an example of what it means to be in work poverty and how it affected just one example of one of my constituents. The members before me have raised vital points. Others who speak afterwards will do the same on in-work poverty. And I want to briefly highlight the effect of in-work poverty on children. There are approximately 450,000 children in Northern Ireland. Over 100,000 of these children are defined as living in poverty. The interesting figure is that the majority of these children, 61%, live in households where at least one parent who is working. In other words, for Slough referred to one where there's only one person in the house working, and that's the ones that I want to refer to if I can. Can I say, I have the utmost respect for the Minister. He really wants to help. I say that honestly for him. I know that in his reply he will try to address the issues that we put forward. I've always found him to be amenable and also tries to give us the answers that we wish. So look forward to that very much. Almost 1 in 4 children in Northern Ireland live in a family which struggles to provide for their basic needs, provide a warm, adequate home, nutritious food, appropriate clothing and pay for childcare costs. Parents often have to go into debt to pay ends meet and don't have the means to save money for unexpected costs or family outings. And these families have just one person working. Children in poverty are twice as likely to leave school with 5 good GCSEs. We're also more likely to suffer from poor mental health and a few years of good physical health as well. So the impact of mental health, poor physical health is really important. It breaks my heart, Sir George, to understand that there are parents working away at low-paid jobs and yet they're physically unable to do better for their children. For someone, the sweat of the brow that we referred to isn't enough to bring a wage into the house that can adequately look after children. For many people, the belief that they would be better off not working is a myth, I believe, for some, that we must fight hard to combat. I know the government wants to fight to combat that, so I look forward very much to what the Minister says. I want to give one example And I use this example because it really does, I believe, illustrate what I want to say. No one should be better off not working. I was helping a mother with her uniform grants forms who's on a universal credit. While she works part-time, she has 3 children by herself. Her partner paid her £5 a week. She received a wage increase and her universal credit went down accordingly. When she mentioned it in work, her supervisor told her, well, drop your work by a couple of hours, as she was no better off. And she stated that her mum raised her to work, and the less she took from the state, the better. This is a difficult view to hold, as the cost of living skyrockets, and those who are working and still poor don't see the benefit of their employers upping their wages. That's an example the honourable gentleman from Slough referred to, those in universal credit, who want to do the best they can, and the system doesn't help them. I use that as an example. The honourable gentleman referred to it, others will do that. The honourable gentleman who spoke before me did the same. I believe we must have a system where it pays to work and not to cut hours. So look after the children, look after the scenario. I'll finish with this. I know that this is a system that everyone wants to have in place, and the first step in it is to ensure that those in work are not poor. They're struggling to pay their mortgage and put diesel in the car. They're cutting down on groceries, stopping the children from going to the cinema with their friends whose parents are not working. There can and must be more done, and we must take those steps so that there can be no doubt that it pays to work, because for many in low-paid jobs, and those are the people who I see, those are the people I see in my constituency office, those are the people I have a duty as an MP, and others have as well, to help. So with that in mind, I thank the honourable gentleman for Slough. I look forward to other contributions, and I look forward very much to the Minister to respond with the answers that we wish to hear. Thank you.
Ruth Jones. Ruth Jones.
Thank you, Sir George, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon. And I'm very grateful to my honourable friend from Slough for bringing this debate before the House today. I'm also while I'm on my feet, I'm very proud of the wonderful diversity in Newport West, and I'd like to wish all Muslims in my constituency and across the country Eid Mubarak today. It is. Sir George, we are here to discuss such an important issue, and I wanted to speak briefly on behalf of the people of Newport West. Yesterday, I spoke in the House about the 9,500 people in Newport West who will now be forced to pay £2,400 more a year thanks to the Tory mortgage bombshell and an inflation crisis made in Downing Street. It's clear to me from my surgeries and all the emails and letters I receive from local people that after 13 years of Tory government, people in Newport West are working harder and doing more but earning less in real terms. In-work poverty is a crisis that ministers seem so unwilling to tackle. One of my constituents recently contacted me to share her story. She has 2 school-aged children. She works 2 jobs in 2 separate superstores and is picking up overtime whenever it's available. She's really proud that she works, but she's not proud that she is struggling to pay for bus fares and to feed her children. This is the living experience of our people. These are the challenges that remain unaddressed by Tory ministers, and these are the difficulties that were made in Downing Street. I hear from local people increasingly because they come to me after all other routes have been closed, because the systems that should support them have been cut to the bone by this Conservative government. Now, I'd like the Minister, when winding up, to tell me what I should say to my constituents and all those who've come to me with their stories of how their monthly pay packet simply doesn't cover the cost of living and survival. But I'm sure the Minister will be able to give us a number of stats to claim things are all fine and hunky-dory. I was in Prime Minister's Question Time this morning as well. But I know my constituents are worse off. They are working all the hours they can get, but it's still not enough. In-work poverty is very real. We are, as already been said, one of the richest countries in this world. It is a disgrace that people are forced to struggle like this. If Tory ministers don't want to sort this out, then they should get out of the way for a government that will. Thank you.
Thank you, Sir George, and it's a pleasure to serve under your chairship, and I thank my honourable friend, the member for Slough, for bringing forward this really important debate on in-work poverty. I just want to raise a few points around the fact that having a job should bring security and be able for people to raise their families, and yet we are seeing so many more people where being in work is actually leading them to being in work poverty. Yep. Research from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation has found that 61% of working age adults in poverty lived in a household where at least one adult was in work, and 11% of all workers lived in a household in poverty. And the poverty rate for part-time workers was double that for full-time workers. 18% compared to 9%, and self-employed workers were twice as likely to be in poverty than employees, 21% compared to 10%. And in-work poverty doesn't affect all groups equally. Rather, ethnic minorities have substantially higher in-work poverty and higher child poverty rates. And many ethnic minority groups are more likely to have the types of jobs and working patterns that are associated with in-work poverty. This Conservative government's cost of living crisis has seen a real terms pay fall at its fastest rate since 2001, when records began. And as we're seeing mortgage rates increase and rents rise, millions will be faced with an increased risk of falling into in-work poverty. And I just want to focus on housing. We're seeing around 2 million private rented households, around 38% of the total of those in the private rented sector receiving housing cost support through the Universal Credit or Housing Benefit. And yet the government chose to freeze the local housing allowance rates between 2016 and 20. And while there was a change in 2020, you appreciate in the pandemic, it's been frozen since that time. Yet in Luton South, in Luton, the Institute for Fiscal Studies analysis shows that there's now a £100 deficit in the local housing allowance rate in comparison with the lowest rents in the area. In fact, we've seen the ONS figures show that the median rent per property paid by tenants in Luton since, an increase since March 2020 to March this year has seen an 8% increase as well. We're also seeing a significant increase in the number of people in a negative budget due to being unable to meet their living costs despite being in work. The causes of negative budgets are complex, but there are fundamentally two reasons: having a low income, being in low paid work, and having high household costs. And in fact, Luton Citizens Advice are seeing increasing numbers of people in negative budget and increasing personal debt and poverty. So I just want to press the Minister to say, ask him to say, what do I say to those families who are working hard, yet struggling to meet their basic living costs? I'm deeply concerned that the lack of action with regards to local housing allowance will see more and more of my Luton South constituents facing evictions as they just simply cannot afford their rent.
Well said.
Thank you, Sir George. It's a pleasure to serve on your chairmanship. And may I also thank my honourable friend, my Berkshire colleague, the Honourable Member for Slough, for his excellent work on this important issue. He's a doughty champion for people from across our county, obviously focused on his constituency. May I also very briefly, in the time that I'm allowed, thank families who are under enormous pressure at this time, incredible pressure, working incredibly hard to keep up with a huge range of increases in costs, whether that's from the price of food, which has rocketed, energy costs, mortgages, rents, a whole series of things. And in the time allowed to me, I just would like to briefly mention a few of these points, and I hope the Minister will be able to respond. And in particular, I hope he'll be able to direct his remarks to colleagues like myself and colleagues from Luton and Slough, where we have many residents in high-cost areas who are under particular pressure because of the high cost of renting and buying homes in the southeast of England and other high-cost areas. First of all, I think it's absolutely staggering that food prices have risen by around 20% in the last few months. And imagine the impact on most families that this is happening. Common staple goods like breakfast cereals, basic foods like Weetabix, cornflakes, pasta, eggs, cheese, other goods that every family relies on in everyday life, which is almost impossible to substitute in a weekly shop. These have all gone up enormously, and this is affecting people across the whole country in the most dreadful way. Families are really struggling because of this, and there's no easy way to avoid this. There's simply no way to substitute most of these products because they're so basic and so commonplace. And as you can imagine, children are desperate for their favourite foods. They're often really keen to have specific things. Even if those are own brand items, the costs have gone up enormously. Equally, the cost of housing has skyrocketed as well. I've had a constituency I mentioned, like my honourable friend from Newport West, we were in the debate yesterday about the terrible pressures in the mortgage market. And I mentioned a couple of constituents who are under enormous pressure, and this is common in my area, huge additional costs on mortgages. In one case, I spoke about a family where they were paying £800 extra a month for a mortgage on a 3-bedroom property in a suburb. another resident who lives in Reading Town Centre having to pay £400 a month extra on the mortgage on her flat, and she's already suffering from the cladding crisis and has unresolved issues because of cladding problems with her property. So imagine the pressure that a person in that situation is under at this terrible time. So I do hope the Minister will kind of will broaden his response and address some of the related issues around housing, and indeed the effect on renters, who of course their landlords are under enormous pressure to put up rents because of the increase in mortgages. Yeah. And that's a related issue, which is hugely important. And as was said earlier, and I think my honourable friend from Barnsley East made an excellent point about this, the number of families who are living on very, very modest incomes, rents increasing dramatically. In the area that I represent, there's been an increase in the proportion of people who rent and a decrease in the number of people who can afford to buy because of the high cost of housing. And that puts particular pressure on many young families, many living in terraced housing or flats in our town centre. But in addition to that, and I hope the Minister will respond to this, energy prices are still extremely high. We still haven't seen a proper windfall tax. There's still enormous pressure on households because of this problem. That will only get worse in the winter and the colder months. It might not seem so immediate to some people now, but it is going to be a huge challenge for many, many residents facing enormous costs. And particularly, if I may make a very brief mention of the many people in this country who still live in poorly insulated properties. Yeah. And in the areas I represent, we have a very large number of terraced houses, equivalent to many British cities and towns of a similar size, such as Derby or Portsmouth or London boroughs or other areas in the north of England, where much of the housing stock is poorly insulated. And this is a related problem which is hugely important, and I do hope the Minister will be able to update us on the government's action on this. So far they have been woeful on this point, and a series of problems have not been addressed, both under the Coalition and under the Conservative governments. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you very much, George. It's a great pleasure to be the Chair, and as others have done, I want to congratulate the Honourable Gentleman, Member for Slough, on securing the debate. It's one of those ones where you have the hour-long debate and you come along and you wonder how many people will be in attendance. It would be fair to say that this has been a well-subscribed debate, hence the need for a time limit. I'm only sorry that the only two Conservatives that are here because they're mandated to be here. I would have thought that in work poverty might have meant just a little bit more than that. Now, can I say that I think that there are a number of things that we can look at when we look at in-work poverty. People will say that it's incredibly complex. In reality, it's because people do not have enough money. That is the brutal reality of it. We're in a situation where we don't have a real living wage in this country. We have a contract that the government talk about, their national living wage, but it is not a real living wage. We're also in a situation, and this is a point that I was pressing the Honourable Gentleman, the Member for Slough, on, where it appears bizarrely now that the two main parties in this place are not of the view that the National Pay Body review should be implemented. And I think that is deeply worrying, because for many of those staff, the very same staff that we clapped during the pandemic, I think it will seem hollow words if we don't back that when it comes to the fact that they are struggling. And in particular, I want to highlight the plight of members of the PCS union. I know my honourable friend, the member for Glasgow South West, also does a huge amount with them as well. The reality is that we have DWP staff who administer the benefit system in the UK who are being fed by a food bank because of poverty pay in their own department. And if that does not shame DWP ministers, then I don't necessarily know what will. There are a number of things that the government could do to tackle in-work poverty. Firstly, looking at the woeful rates of statutory sick pay, the fact that people have to earn a minimum of £123 before statutory sick pay kicks in. They should also look at fixing some of the known problems with universal credit, which of course is an in-work benefit. We often hear from the government the importance of working your way out of poverty, but for the people that I represent, many of whom go out and do a decent day's work, they are in a ridiculous situation at the moment where every time they go to the supermarket, they're seeing baby formula put behind the tills because people are stealing it. They're seeing butter security tagged because people are being put in a position where, frankly, they do not have enough money. And it comes back to that same problem of in-work poverty. The government can talk all it likes about the importance of working to get out of poverty, but as we have heard today during this debate, the biggest problem for people who are in in-work poverty is because they're not being paid enough. And I would just finish off by saying that one of the best ways of tackling in-work poverty is to join a trade union and make sure that you use that leverage in your workplace to get a fair day's pay for a fair day's work. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sir George. It's a pleasure to be here under your chairmanship, and also I congratulate my honourable friend, the member for Slough, on introducing this debate and setting out a very powerful and well-argued case for action on the scourge of in-work poverty. And we've also heard excellent contributions from a number of members, including the member for Wandsworth, for Wansbeck, Newport West, Luton South and Reading. I think a theme that's been consistent through all of this is the extent to which the problem of in-work poverty, which as we know has risen over the course of a number of years, has been so much exacerbated by the cost of living crisis that we've been grappling with over the last year, and that in turn also is driven by factors including core food inflation, which is worse in this country than in our neighbouring countries, the crisis of housing costs, which has been driven by rising mortgages and by rising rents and by a decade of low wage growth. And the Trussell Trust's figures today, which should shame the government, should shame any government, that we have a scourge of food insecurity affecting millions of people. And as has been alluded to by many of my friends on this side, it has proven to be the case that work is not in itself a means of ensuring that people are not food insecure. And my own food bank and food banks in the constituencies of my honourable friends are all reporting the unprecedented demand for assistance from people who are working.
I wondered if she wanted to comment on the fact that now work isn't the route out of poverty, as we have heard, and in terms of what the government is proposing around in-work progression, we still haven't seen anything that's going to actually have and make an impact on that.
No, I mean, I will touch on in a second the point about the work being the route out of poverty. We all want to see people in work. We want to see people in good work, and we want to see people in well-paid work. The fact that work is not a route out of poverty has been proven amply over recent years, and more so than previously. But I would also say to my friends and to members that work in itself is not necessarily a route out of poverty for people bringing up children, and it has always been and remains the case that the government has a role to play in ensuring that working families and working families with children receive support, and that is not simply left to wages. The story, Sir George, of in-work poverty over the last 13 years is one of wasted opportunity. One of the most underappreciated social changes of recent decades has been the decline in family worklessness. When Labour came into government in 1997, we inherited a situation where 1 in 5 children were living in a workless household. On the most recent data, 9% of children are in workless households. The decline in family worklessness has been an almost continuous trend over the last 2 and more decades outside of economic downturns. So not only are there now far fewer children in workless families than there were a generation ago, there are more couple families in which both adults are working and fewer in which only one parent is working. And all of these changes should be positive for poverty reduction. Work is the best route out of poverty was always, as I said, a glib soundbite that dismisses the challenges faced by people who cannot work, whether due to disability or health or caring responsibilities. But it is true that, as a general rule, parental employment greatly reduces the risk of poverty. So, on the face of it, the employment situation for families with children is incomparably better than it was a generation ago. And yet, despite continuing improvements in parental employment, child poverty is higher in 21-22 than it was in 2010-11. The link between increased employment and poverty reduction broke down somewhere around the middle of the last decade. 19% of children in families with someone in work were in poverty after housing costs. By 2019-20, that figure had risen to 26%. Fell back very slightly on the latest data for 21-22, I suspect to do with the boost provided to universal credit and other things during the pandemic, but even that is very likely to do with pandemic measures. Astonishingly, the poverty rate after housing costs for children in single-earner families with full-time work is now 44%. Given the changes to employment over this period, had the risk of poverty for working families remained where it was when Labour left office in 2010, we would now be looking at far fewer children in poverty. And that is what I mean about wasted opportunity. Just think, the historical record of Conservative-led governments would be one of poverty reduction. Ministers would be able to proudly defend their record on child poverty. They wouldn't need to switch poverty measures to confuse people. They would be quite happy to be judged on the headline relative poverty measure. How did this all happen? Well, faced with employment trends that would have reduced poverty, we had policies that made working as well as out-of-work families poorer, most specifically the benefit freeze that permanently reduced the value of both in-work and out-of-work support. Universal Credit, Sir George, was designed around a single-earner household model and continues to provide poorer rewards for second earners when they increase their hours and earnings. The government's response to the weak incentives in Universal Credit is the crude stick of in-work conditionality, virtually an admission that the government doesn't expect second earners to be dramatically better off if they increase their earnings. And for too long, job centre policy has been concerned with getting people into any job without considering crucial aspects of job quality, such as stability and predictability of earnings and progression. If we want work to be the main route out of poverty reduction, and we do, for those who can work, it needs to be work where people can genuinely improve their incomes over time, rather than struggle with zero-hour contracts, unpredictable shift patterns and fluctuating earnings. So the lesson, Sir George, is that increasing parental employment is a necessary but not a sufficient condition for reducing child poverty. If you want to reduce poverty, you need a genuinely supportive welfare state and a focus on job quality. These have been the missing ingredients in government policy since 2010, leading to the squandering of opportunities for poverty reduction.
Sir George, it's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship, and I'd like to congratulate the Honourable Member for Slough for securing this debate. He and others have raised a number of different policy issues which are not in my particular portfolio, but I'll try and deal with those briefly if I can. In respect of housing, I'm not the housing minister, but he will be aware that in 2022-2023, the government is projected to spend £30 billion to support renters. That is 1.4% of GDP. He may criticise that as an insufficient sum, but he should be aware that in the OECD, that is the highest of any country in the OECD spending on housing rental support. The next highest, we being at 1.4%, is 0.9% of GDP. And clearly, this is a higher figure than when we came into office. Secondly, in production of homes, he raised on his second point of housing, we have built 2.2 million additional homes since coming into office. Housing starts are double the number we inherited from the Labour government in 2010. More homes are meeting decent home standards, and housing supply is up 10% in the last year we have figures for, and the most recent figures show that the 20-year high in the number of new buyers. On education, he raised specifically free school meals. I'm not aware that that is actually Labour frontbench policy, but he has the joy of backbench freedom to roam and create new policy. But in any event, it's not even the SNP policy, although they briefly did adopt it, but obviously parked it in a motorhome, and it is driven off into the distance of some strange new world of new policy. Certainly, of course I'll give way to the honourable gentleman. I look forward to his defence of all matters motorhomes and policy.
I'm certainly not going to stray into the 1981 Contempt of Court Act, which I'm sure the Minister wouldn't do as a former solicitor either. But given that he seems to know so much about the free school meals position in Scotland, can he just outline to the Chamber when free school meals kick in? Because I'm sure he does know, doesn't he?
Well, so as I indicated, I'm not the Education Minister, but what I am going to do, is I'm going to set out the position, and I will happily make the point that it is not Labour Party policy. It used to be, as I understand it, they proposed universal free school meals, but recently said they would need to target it. In other words, they would need to make it means tested. The policy, bear with me, I'm just trying to, I'm just going to try and answer this particular point. So the reality of the situation on free school meals, the Honourable Gentleman may chunter away and as much as he like, but I'm going to try and set him out. So on the reality of free school meals, under the benefits-based criteria, which I believe is what the SNP government is wishing to do, 2 million of the most disadvantaged pupils are eligible for and claim a free school meal. That is 23.8% of all pupils in state-funded schools. The number eligible for free school meals has increased since 2016-17 at 1.128 million, down up to 2,019,000. Almost 1.3 additional infants enjoy a free, healthy and nutritious meal at lunchtime, following the introduction by this government, with the coalition to be fair, of the universal infant preschool meal policy in 2014. And the government has extended the eligibility more than any other, and taken together we spend over £1 billion per annum delivering free lunches to the greatest ever proportion of school children, over 1/3 of school children. I move away from those particular policies. The Honourable Gentleman for Wansbeck raised a couple of points that I want to try and address. He was very critical of the Prime Minister, and that's perfectly his right to be so, but the Prime Minister is a gentleman of wealth now, but he must remember that he is the son of a pharmacist and a GP who grew up in Southampton. He also talked about his particular constituency, and he will be aware that in Ashington, I set up in his constituency the Northumberland Community Bank, the bank that is the fastest growing credit union in the north, that is, without a shadow of a doubt, doing amazing work, providing support for loans to local people in Northumberland. And I would respectfully say that it is an amazing institution which I hope he supports. On childcare, of course I will.
Would the Minister kindly just inform the House what indeed those last remarks have actually got to do with this debate?
Well, the Honourable Gentleman raised the issues in respect of support for working people. The Northumberland Community Bank is a fantastic institution which provides savings and loans to those in difficulties. It's a cooperative, which I'm sure he supports. It was set up in Northumberland. It is the success story, I would respectfully invite him, and it's based in his own constituency. I move on. The government support is underpinned by the wider welfare system, and I want to try and set out some of those particular points. In 2023-2024, we will spend around £276 billion through the welfare system in Great Britain, including £124 billion on people of working age and their children. Benefit rates on state pensions have increased by 10.1% for 23-24, and the benefit cap has been increased by the same amount. The reality of the situation is that this country has never spent as much as it presently does in the support that it does. I'm going to make some progress, if you don't mind.
I don't want to be unkind to the Honourable Lady, but in the previous debate we held, I did point out to an Honourable Member that to arrive at the end of a debate and do an intervention is not necessarily the right way to go about things. If she insists, she can do it, but no, Minister.
So, our commitment to protecting the most vulnerable is reflected in the action we have taken over the past 2 years, as people continue to face the cost of living pressures, which are clearly evident and are fundamentally derived from the impact of the COVID pandemic and then the subsequent war in Ukraine and the impact that has had on energy and other costs. Overall, in 2023 and 2024, we are providing total support worth over £94 billion to help people with rising bills. That's an average of over £3,300 per household. Last year, we made cost of living payments of up to £650 to over 8 million low-income households. This year, eligible households will continue to receive additional payments of up to £900, and the first £301 payment to 8.3 million households, worth over £2.5 billion in total, has recently been paid. Further payments will be made this year. In addition, over 6 million people across the UK on eligible extra cost disability benefits have been paid a further £150 disability cost of living payment. The practical reality is that we have made progress. In 2021-22, there were 1.7 million fewer people in absolute poverty after housing costs than in 29-10, including 400,000 fewer children. Furthermore, there are now nearly 1 million fewer workless households than in 2010. That is why, with over 1 million vacancies across the UK, our focus is firmly on supporting people in work, and our core job centre offer provides a range of options, including face-to-face work coach support and help to boost interview and employment skills. The taper has been changed, and I believe this is very much of assistance, because we've taken decisive action on making work pay by cutting the universal credit taper from 63% to 55% and increasing the universal credit work allowance by £500 a year, allowing households to keep more of what they earn. The national living wage has increased by a record level of 9.7% to 10.42 pence per hour from this April. This represents a rise of over £1,600 to the gross annual earnings of a full-time worker. To help people progress, we're extending the support offered by our job centres to low-paid workers so they can increase their hours and move into better quality jobs. There are two key measures on this, the in-work progression offer and increasing the administrative earnings thresholds in universal credit. The in-work progression office is now live across all job centres in Great Britain, and we estimate that around 1.4 million low-paid claimants are eligible for work coach support. I'm conscious of time. I do want to address one key point, because legitimate points were raised in respect of cost of living and earnings, but I am pleased that today the Department for Work and Pensions has raised the amount that working parents on universal credit can claim for their childcare. This is up to £951 a month for one child and £1,630 for two or more children. This is an increase of approximately 47% from previous limits, which was 646 and 1108 for two children. That is a massive increase in childcare support for working parents, a massive assistance to those who are working, and I hope the House would welcome that. The government is also helping eligible parents cover the costs for the first month of the childcare when they enter work and as they increase their working hours. In addition to that, the House will be aware of the expansion of the 30 hours of funded childcare that this government originally introduced in 2017, and is extending that entitlement to eligible working parents of children aged from 9 months old to when they start primary school. It will remove one of the largest hurdles working parents face by giving a huge boost to the amount of funded childcare they can access and saving parents around £6,500 a year. Taken collectively, we have heard loud and clear that there is a need for a better amount of support on particular childcare. In respect of this particular point, we will provide £204 million of extra funding for local authorities to increase the hourly rates they pay providers. We'll make sure that rates continue to go up each year. The conclusion, Sir George, I should say, apologies, is that this government is committed to tackling poverty, both in and out of work. We are focusing on making work pay and on progression opportunities. We will ensure that everyone has the opportunity to move into a job where they can realise their potential.
Manjit Singh Desai.
Thank you very much, Sir George, for chairing today's important debate on in-work poverty. And my thank you also to the Minister, the Labour Shadow Minister and the SNP spokesman for their responses, as well as honourable members who have made such sobering, excellent contributions, speeches and interventions. My gratitude also to the House of Commons Library for providing accurate and relevant statistics. Thanks to the Crisis, Trussell Trust, Joseph Rowntree Foundation and Slough Food Bank for providing their analysis, as well as the brilliant work that they do within my Slough constituency and across our country. Sir George, while ministers may want to blame whether it's COVID, the war in Ukraine or the energy crisis, the truth is that in-work poverty has been caused by low and insecure earnings, high cost of living and little affordable housing. And as has been very eloquently explained by my honourable friends, that the problems are worse for marginalised communities, especially many within the ethnic minority communities. And all three of the problems that I've highlighted are consequences of government incompetence and ideology. All three have led to stagnation and suffering. And according to the Charity Crisis, 1 in 4 households who became homeless in 2022 have at least one person in work. And the crisis of in-work poverty is leading to a crisis of in-work homelessness caused by a toxic mix of low-paid, insecure work and lack of affordable housing. And that's why we in our country have a situation where many people are going into work without having a home to return to. So, George, we must be in a position whereby people within our country, or in any country, they should be able to aspire a decent wage, to own their own home and aspire to raise and support a family. But the government must ensure that people can aspire to more than merely survive. Thank you very much.
Order, order, order. The sitting is now